How's it going, everyone? Today's how-to video is all about the essentials that you're going to need for sewing leather on a home domestic sewing machine. So one of the main things that you're going to need for sewing leather is a domestic sewing machine. I've been really lucky to have been given this machine by my sponsors Tysew. It's a Denomi, which is always a really good brand for domestic machines, and it's a 2200. So it's really good because it does go through quite thick amounts of material or leather. The main thing I'm always looking for when I'm thinking about sewing leather on domestics is to just have something that's got a really good weight to it. Obviously leather is quite thick, so you just want to make sure that you've not got a really flimsy machine. Now, ironically, this is one of the ones that I started with back in 2008 when I launched my brand. It's a really old Bernina, but the beauty of the older machines is they were actually built with kind of metal hardware and metal components. So, you know, to lift this up, it's really heavy. But the great thing about that is it does plow through thicker things, including leather. But with the newer machines, you really want to look for something that, again, has got quite good weight to it. And this actually has a presser foot gauge. So the presser foot is this foot here. And what this machine allows you to do is adjust that. So when you're sewing through quite a lot of sort of layers of the leather, the more pressure you put on the foot, the more the machine will actually handle the stitching, and you'll hopefully not get any skipped stitches. But there's loads of tricks that I'm going to show you as well that will hopefully prevent that from happening. So I'd highly recommend this one as a new one to buy. But if any of you have already got an old Bernina or any of the old machines and it's up in your attic, then dust it off and that will be great for sewing leather. One of the most important things when sewing leather is to make sure you've got the correct needle. So we use a leather point needle. Now they differ from normal sewing needles. Normal sewing needles have an actual sort of point on the bottom of it. Leather point needles, what they have is a knife edge. So what you find is it actually sort of slashes through the leather, and it just really helps the machine to create a really regular stitch. So that's the most important thing, is to look out for the leather point needle. But the other thing is really actually thinking about the size. What I've found in the past is actually the bigger the better when it comes to sewing on the domestic machine, sewing leather, is actually go for a really big needle. So I tend to go for 120 size, but you could maybe go down to 110. Possibly 100, but I'd really recommend trying to go as high up to the 120s as possible. The next essential that you're going to need is a Teflon foot. So these are absolutely wonderful because they don't stick on the surface of the leather. So if you're normally using a metal foot, you'll notice if you're sewing leather, it sometimes drags a little bit. But similar to your non-stick frying pans, these Teflons just glide over the surface of the leather. Now, some people say to me, oh, I've got a walking foot. And actually, in my opinion, walking feet are brilliant as well. So if you do have a walking foot, this basically sort of jumps over the surface of the leather. So although it is metal, the walking foot element of it is absolutely brilliant on leather. So if you've got one of those, amazing, but I just find them quite clunky. So we do a lot of pivoting when we're sewing leather. And so you might just find this is sort of quite cumbersome at the back. So my ideal is to use a Teflon, but if you've already got a walking foot, then that's brilliant too. Now, these are optional, but I find them so handy when it comes to working with leather. They're called Quilting Clips. And with leather, you just can't pin it. You're going to hurt your fingers so much and it would leave a hole in the leather. So you're going to need something to hold the leather in preparation for sewing. And these little beauties are so handy. So you just clip along your seam line. When you start sewing, you're obviously going to take them off, but it's a brilliant way of holding your leather together. The next thing I'm going to recommend is silicone spray. Now this stuff again is optional, but it's brilliant for kind of lubricating the top surface of the leather. Again, when you're sewing, so even if you've got your Teflon foot and your walking foot, in addition, if you give the leather just a little spray, then it can really help the machine to glide over the surface of the leather. So this is only what you'd use on the surface. You wouldn't ever use this on the underneath of the leather. If you have some and you've got a DIY store that stocks it nearby, fantastic. But if you don't, it's not really essential, but it can help. The next thing I'm going to recommend is a magnetic seam adjuster. So this is absolutely brilliant for marking out where you want to do your seam. If your machine has a metal plate on it, you're just going to pop the magnet down. Now we do 1 centimetre seam allowance for most of our seam lines, and it just means that as you're sewing, you're just going to have the raw edge of your leather running up against the magnet, and you get a perfectly measured 1 centimetre seam allowance without having to worry too much about following anything with your eye. Now again, they are optional, but all of my students absolutely love them and end up buying one at the end of lesson, so I'd highly recommend getting one. That's all the essentials that you're going to need for sewing leather on your home domestic sewing machines. We've got loads of how-to videos and online courses coming soon, so stay tuned.